Illiterate janitor invited to teach at Harvard. The reason is unbelievable. In the bustling halls of Harvard University, an unlikely figure emerges: Maria Gonzalez, a 45-year-old illiterate janitor with calloused hands and a heart of gold. When an extraordinary sequence of events leads to her being invited to teach at this prestigious institution, the academic world is turned upside down. But as Maria's incredible journey unfolds, it becomes clear that her invitation is just the beginning of a tale that will challenge everything we thought we knew about intelligence, education, and the human spirit. Prepare to have your assumptions shattered in this unbelievable story of triumph against all odds. In the pre-dawn darkness of Cambridge, Massachusetts, Maria Gonzalez's weathered hands gripped the worn handle of her mop, moving in practiced circles across the polished floors of Harvard's Widener Library. The 45-year-old janitor hummed softly to herself, a melody from her childhood in rural Mexico, as she worked tirelessly in the shadows of one of the world's most prestigious institutions. The library was eerily quiet at this hour, with only the occasional creak of an old bookshelf or the distant hum of the heating system breaking the silence. Maria preferred it this way. In the stillness, she could almost pretend she belonged among the towering shelves of knowledge, even though she couldn't read a single word on their spines. As she rounded a corner, her mop clattered against something unexpected. Maria squinted in the dim light, her heart racing as she realized she'd bumped into a pair of expensive leather shoes. Her eyes traveled upward, meeting the stern gaze of Professor Jonathan Blackwell, the renowned linguist and current dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. "I'm so sorry, sir," Maria stammered, her thick accent betraying her nervousness. "I didn't see you there. Are you okay?" Professor Blackwell's expression softened slightly. "No harm done, Mrs. Gonzalez, sir." "Maria Gonzalez." The professor nodded, his eyes drifting to the book in his hands, a rare first edition of a 17th century text on indigenous American languages. "Tell me, Mrs. Gonzalez, what do you think of this passage?" He held the book open, pointing to a complex diagram of phonetic symbols. Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame. I'm sorry, sir. I can't read," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. To her surprise, Professor Blackwell's eyes lit up with interest rather than pity or disdain. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to Maria. "Tell me, Mrs. Gonzalez, what languages do you speak?" Maria blinked, confused by the unexpected question. "Well, Spanish is my first language, and English, of course, though not very well. And I understand some Nahuatl. That's the language of my grandmother's people." The professor's eyebrows shot up. "Nahuatl? The ancient language of the Aztecs? That's extraordinary." He closed the book with a snap, his mind clearly racing. "Mrs. Gonzalez, I believe you, and I need to have a longer conversation. Would you be willing to meet me in my office later today?" Maria nodded, bewildered by the turn of events. As Professor Blackwell strode away, his shoes clicking on the freshly mopped floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous had just occurred. Little did she know that this chance encounter in the early hours of the morning would set in motion a chain of events that would change her life and the face of Harvard University forever. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the library's stained glass windows, Maria returned to her work, her mind swirling with questions. What could the esteemed professor possibly want with an illiterate janitor? And why did she have the nagging feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something both exhilarating and terrifying? The mop moved across the floor once more, but this time, it felt different. Each stroke seemed to whisper of possibilities, of doors long thought closed suddenly creaking open. As Maria finished her shift and headed home to her tiny apartment in Somerville, she couldn't help but wonder, what would tomorrow bring? Maria's tiny apartment in Somerville was a far cry from the grandeur of Harvard's hallowed halls. As she fumbled with her keys, the weight of exhaustion from her night shift settling into her bones, she could hear the muffled sounds of her neighbors' lives through the thin walls. A baby crying, a couple arguing in rapid-fire Spanish, the tinny sound of a television turned up too loud. Inside, the apartment was modest but meticulously clean. Maria's eyes fell on a framed photo on the cluttered side table. A younger version of herself stood proudly next to her late husband, Miguel, both of them beaming at the camera. Their son, Carlos, just a toddler then, sat perched on Miguel's shoulders. Miguel, Maria sighed, touching the frame gently. What would you think of me now? As she prepared a simple breakfast of huevos rancheros, her mind drifted back to her childhood in the small village of San Juan Teotihuacan, Mexico. She could almost smell the earthy scent of her grandmother's herb garden, hear the lilting cadence of the old woman's voice as she spoke in Nahuatl, passing down ancient wisdom and forgotten stories. No Canetzin, her grandmother would say, using the Nahuatl word for my child. Our words are sacred. They carry the breath of our ancestors. Never forget where you come from. A lump formed in Maria's throat as she remembered the day she'd had to leave school at the age of 10 to help support her family. The shame of not being able to read or write had followed her like a shadow ever since, even as she'd worked tirelessly to give her son the education she'd never had. The shrill ring of the telephone jolted her from her reverie. Maria answered, her heart skipping a beat when she heard her son's voice. Mama, are you okay? You sound tired, Carlos said, concern evident in his voice. I'm fine, Mijo, Maria assured him, pride swelling in her chest at the thought of her boy, now a sophomore at Boston University. Just finished my shift. How are your studies? As Carlos launched into an excited explanation of his latest research project, Maria found her thoughts drifting to her impending meeting with Professor Blackwell. Should she tell Carlos about it? No, she decided. Better not to get his hopes up. After all, what could possibly come of a meeting between a renowned scholar and an illiterate janitor? After saying goodbye to Carlos, Maria glanced at the clock. She had just enough time for a short nap before heading back to Harvard. As she drifted off to sleep, her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Nunca olvides de donde vienes. Never forget where you come from. Little did Maria know that her past, the very thing she'd spent years trying to overcome, was about to become the key to an extraordinary future. As she slept, across the city, Professor Blackwell was making a series of phone calls that would set in motion events that would challenge the very foundations of one of the world's most prestigious universities. In her dreams, Maria found herself back in her grandmother's garden, the old woman's wise eyes twinkling with a secret. Preparat me, Nina, the wizened voice whispered. Prepare yourself. Your journey is just beginning. When Maria awoke a few hours later, the lingering echoes of her dream clung to her like cobwebs. She shook them off, chiding herself for being fanciful. Yet, as she prepared to return to Harvard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. With a deep breath, she stepped out of her apartment and into the crisp autumn air, unaware that she was walking towards a destiny that would redefine not just her life, but the lives of countless others. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on a story that would captivate the world. Maria's footsteps echoed through the ornate hallways of Harvard's main administration building. Her work-worn hands fidgeted nervously with the strap of her faded purse as she approached Professor Blackwell's office. The polished nameplate on the door seemed to mock her inability to read it. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. "Come in, Mrs. Gonzalez," Professor Blackwell's voice called from inside. As Maria entered, she was struck by the contrast between this opulent office and her usual domain of mops and cleaning supplies. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with tomes and languages she couldn't begin to identify. The professor sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, a kindly smile on his face. "Please have a seat," he gestured to a plush chair across from him. Maria perched on the edge of the seat, feeling out of place in her simple clothes. "Thank you for meeting with me, Professor," she began hesitantly. "But I'm not sure why I'm here." Professor Blackwell leaned forward, his eyes alight with excitement. "Mrs. Gonzalez, what would you say if I told you that you possess knowledge that could be invaluable to our linguistics department?" Maria blinked in confusion. "Me? But I can't even read, sir." "Ah, but literacy and knowledge are not always the same thing," the professor countered. "You mentioned speaking Nahuatl, correct?" Maria nodded slowly. Yes, but only a little. My grandmother taught me. That little could be incredibly significant, Professor Blackwell explained. You see, Nahuatl is a dying language. There are very few native speakers left, and even fewer who can provide insights into its historical usage and cultural context. He paused, letting his words sink in. Mrs. Gonzalez, I'd like to propose something unconventional. We want you to teach a seminar on Nahuatl language and culture here at Harvard. Maria's jaw dropped. Teach? At Harvard? But that's impossible. I'm just a janitor. I don't have any degrees. I can't even read the textbooks. Professor Blackwell held up a hand to stop her protests. We're not looking for someone to teach from textbooks. We're looking for someone with lived experience. Someone who can share the oral traditions and linguistic nuances that can't be found in any book. He leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. Of course, this would be a significant change. We'd provide you with a teaching assistant to help with any written materials. You'd need to take a leave from your custodial duties. And I won't lie, this proposal is already facing some resistance from certain members of the faculty. Maria's head was spinning. Teach at Harvard? The very idea seemed ludicrous. And yet, a small voice inside her, a voice that sounded suspiciously like her grandmother, whispered that this was her chance to honor her heritage, to pass on the knowledge that had been entrusted to her. I don't know what to say, Maria stammered. Say yes, Professor Blackwell urged. You have a unique opportunity here, Mrs. Gonzalez. Not just to teach, but to learn, to preserve a piece of your culture that might otherwise be lost. As Maria sat there, torn between fear and an unexpected surge of excitement, neither she nor the professor noticed the figure lingering just outside the office door. Professor Elizabeth Thornton, head of the linguistics department, had been about to knock when she overheard their conversation. Her face twisted into a scowl as she silently retreated down the hallway, her mind already formulating plans to put a stop to this preposterous idea. Back in the office, Maria took a deep breath. If you truly think I can do this, Professor, she said slowly, then, yes, I'll do it. Professor Blackwell's face broke into a wide grin. Excellent. We'll start making arrangements immediately. Welcome to the faculty, Professor Gonzalez. As Maria left the office in a daze, the weight of what she'd just agreed to began to settle on her shoulders. She was about to step into a world she barely understood, facing challenges she couldn't even imagine. But as she walked through the halls of Harvard, her head held just a little higher. She couldn't help but feel that somehow, against all odds, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Little did she know that her journey was about to become far more complicated and dangerous than she could have ever anticipated. The news of Maria Gonzalez's appointment spread through Harvard's campus like wildfire. Within days, it seemed everyone had an opinion on the illiterate professor, as some had begun calling her. The reactions ranged from curiosity and excitement to outright hostility. Maria felt the weight of these conflicting attitudes as she made her way across the quad, no longer pushing a cleaning cart, but instead clutching a folder of materials her teaching assistant, a bright-eyed graduate student named Sarah, had prepared for her. Don't let them get to you, Professor Gonzalez, Sarah said encouragingly as they walked. What you're doing is important. Maria managed a weak smile, but her stomach churned with anxiety. The whispers and stares from passing students and faculty made her feel like an imposter in her new role. As they approached the linguistics building, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A small group of students held signs with slogans like "Maintain academic standards" and "Literacy matters." At the forefront stood a tall, distinguished-looking woman whom Maria recognized as Professor Elizabeth Thornton. "This is an outrage," Thornton was saying to a cluster of reporters. "Harvard's reputation is built on academic excellence. Appointing an illiterate janitor as a professor makes a mockery of everything we stand for." Maria froze, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. Sarah placed a protective hand on her arm, but before either of them could react, an unexpected voice cut through the crowd. "And what exactly do we stand for, Elizabeth?" The protesters parted to reveal Professor Blackwell, his usually genial face set in stern lines. Elitism, narrow-mindedness, or perhaps the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms. Blackwell continued, his voice carrying across the now-silent gathering. Thornton's face reddened. "Jonathan, you can't possibly defend this farce." "What I'm defending," Blackwell replied calmly, "is the university's mission to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. Mrs. Gonzalez possesses unique insights into a dying language and culture. Her inability to read doesn't negate that knowledge. If anything, it makes her perspective even more valuable." As the two professors continued their heated debate, Maria felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see an elderly man with kind eyes and a worn baseball cap. "Excuse me," he said softly, "but are you the new Nahuatl professor?" Maria nodded hesitantly. The man's face broke into a wide smile. "My grandfather was Nawa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never got the chance to learn the language. Your class. It might be my last chance to connect with that part of my heritage." Tears pricked at Maria's eyes as the man's words sank in. For the first time since this whirlwind began, she felt a sense of purpose, of the true weight of what she was undertaking. Meanwhile, the confrontation between Blackwell and Thornton had drawn a larger crowd, including several members of the media. Cameras flashed as Thornton, realizing she was losing ground, switched tactics. "This isn't about elitism," she insisted. "It's about maintaining the integrity of our educational standards. How can someone who can't read or write possibly teach at a university level?" A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to Maria. She felt the weight of their stares, the expectations, the judgments. For a moment, she considered turning and fleeing, returning to the safety and anonymity of her mop and bucket. But then she thought of her grandmother, of the stories and language she'd passed down. She thought of the old man who'd just spoken to her, and of all the others who might be yearning to reconnect with their roots. Taking a deep breath, Maria stepped forward. "You're right, Professor Thornton," she said, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I can't read or write, but I can speak. I can remember. I carry with me the stories and language of my ancestors, knowledge that isn't written in any of your textbooks." The crowd listened in rapt silence as Maria continued. "I may not have a degree, but I have lived experience. I have a connection to a culture and language that is fading from this world. If I can share even a fraction of that knowledge, isn't that worth something?" As she finished speaking, a slow applause began, growing louder until it drowned out any remaining protests. Professor Blackwell beamed with pride, while Thornton, her face a mask of barely concealed fury, stormed off without another word. As the crowd began to disperse, Maria felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. She had stood her ground, but she knew this was only the beginning. The real test would come in the classroom, where she would have to prove her worth not just to herself, but to some of the brightest young minds in the country. Little did she know that her impromptu speech had just been broadcast live on local news, setting in motion a series of events that would catapult her story far beyond the confines of Harvard's campus. As Maria finally entered the linguistics building, her mind reeling from the confrontation, seeds of both opportunity and danger were already beginning to sprout across the nation. The day of Maria's first lecture arrived with a palpable tension in the air. Room 305 of the linguistics building was packed to capacity, with students spilling out into the hallway. Some were there out of genuine interest, others out of morbid curiosity, eager to see if the illiterate professor would crash and burn. Maria stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she surveyed the sea of expectant faces. Sarah, her teaching assistant, gave her an encouraging nod from the front row. "Buenos dias," Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Buenos dias. Good morning, Nilsa." A murmur rippled through the crowd at the unfamiliar Nahuatl greeting. "I am Maria Gonzalez," she continued, gaining confidence. "And today, we begin a journey together into the heart of the Nahuatl language and the Nahua people." As Maria spoke, weaving together personal anecdotes, cultural insights, and linguistic lessons, something remarkable began to happen. The skeptical expressions on many students' faces gradually gave way to genuine interest. Even those who had come expecting a disaster found themselves drawn in by Maria's authentic passion and unique perspective. She taught them to count in Nahuatl, explaining how the vigesimal system reflected the ancient Mesoamerican calendar. She shared creation myths and folk tales, demonstrating how the language's intricate metaphors and compound words painted vivid pictures of the Nahua worldview. In Nahuatl, Maria explained, her eyes shining, the word for poet is flower and song, Xochitl in Cuicatl, because for my ancestors, words were not just sounds, but living things that bloomed and sang. As the lecture progressed, Maria felt a growing sense of confidence. This was her element. Here, in this room, her inability to read or write didn't matter. What mattered was the knowledge she carried, passed down through generations, now finding new life in the minds of these students. However, not everyone was won over. In the back of the room, a young man with a permanent scowl furiously scribbled notes. This was Jason Thornton, Professor Elizabeth Thornton's son and a graduate student in the linguistics department. He had come determined to find fault, to gather ammunition for his mother's crusade against Maria's appointment. As the class neared its end, Jason raised his hand. "Professor Gonzalez," he said, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt, "can you explain how you plan to grade our papers or provide written feedback, given your limitations?" A hush fell over the room. Maria felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, another student spoke up. "Seriously, dude?" It was a young woman in the front row. "Did you miss the entire point of this class? We're here to learn things that can't be found in books." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Jason's face reddened as he realized he had miscalculated badly. Maria held up a hand for quiet. "It's a fair question," she said calmly. "I won't pretend that my inability to read and write isn't a challenge. But that's why I have Sarah, my wonderful TA, to help with written materials. And as for grading, well," she smiled, "perhaps we need to rethink what constitutes valuable academic work in a class like this. Maybe your papers will be recorded stories or oral presentations. We're exploring a primarily oral tradition, after all. Shouldn't our methods reflect that?" The students broke into applause, drowning out any further protests Jason might have made. As they filed out at the end of the class, many lingered to thank Maria or ask further questions. The energy in the room was electric, filled with the buzz of new ideas and perspectives. As the last student left, Maria sank into a chair, exhausted but exhilarated. She had done it. She had taught a class at Harvard, and by all accounts, it had been a success. But as Sarah helped her gather her materials, neither of them noticed Jason Thornton lingering in the hallway, his face twisted with anger and determination. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Mom," he said as soon as the call connected. "We need to talk. This Gonzalez woman. She's more dangerous than we thought." As Maria left the building, basking in the afterglow of her successful debut, she was unaware of the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Her triumph in the classroom had not only energized her supporters, but also galvanized her opponents. The battle for her place at Harvard, and for the very soul of education itself, was about to escalate in ways she could never have imagined. In the days following Maria's inaugural lecture, the story of the illiterate professor exploded across national media. News vans crowded Harvard Yard, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal trees. Social media buzzed with hashtags both supportive, #KnowledgeNotDegrees, and critical, #Harvard Standards. Maria found herself at the center of a cultural firestorm she was ill-equipped to handle. Her phone rang incessantly with interview requests from major networks and talk shows. Even a Hollywood producer called, floating the idea of a movie based on her life. "I don't understand," Maria confided to Sarah as they huddled in her tiny office, away from the media circus. "Why does everyone care so much about me?" Sarah sighed, her young face creased with worry. "You've become a symbol, Professor. For some, you represent the democratization of education, the idea that knowledge can come from unexpected places. For others, she hesitated. Well, you challenge their notions of what a Harvard professor should be. As if to underscore Sarah's point, a rock suddenly crashed through the office window, showering them with glass. Attached was a note with a crude message: "Go back to cleaning toilets." Shaken, Maria picked up the rock with trembling hands. Maybe this was a mistake," she whispered. Meanwhile, across campus, Professor Elizabeth Thornton was holding court in her opulent office. Surrounding her were several like-minded faculty members and influential alumni, all united in their opposition to Maria's appointment. "This farce has gone on long enough," Thornton declared, her voice sharp with disdain. "Gonzalez's presence is making a mockery of everything Harvard stands for. We must take action." Jason, lurking in the corner, spoke up. "I've been digging into her background," he said eagerly. "There might be some irregularities with her immigration status." Thornton's eyes glittered. "Excellent work, son. We'll leak that to the press. And I've drafted a petition calling for her immediate dismissal. With enough signatures from faculty and alumni, the board will have to act." As the group plotted, none of them noticed the maintenance worker who had been fixing a light fixture in the hallway. He quietly packed up his tools and slipped away, his mind racing with what he'd overheard. Across town, in a modest diner in Somerville, Professor Blackwell sat across from Carlos, Maria's son. The young man's face was a mask of concern as Blackwell explained the situation. "Your mother is in a difficult position," Blackwell said gently. "There are powerful people who want to see her fail, but there are also many who believe in what she's doing. The question is, how do we protect her while allowing her to continue her important work?" Carlos ran a hand through his hair, his mind whirling. "I don't know," he admitted. "Mom's always been so private, so careful. Now she's all over the news. She must be terrified." As they spoke, the TV in the diner switched to a breaking news segment. Maria's face filled the screen, alongside a cheer-in that read, "Harvard's illiterate professor. Inspiring story or academic fraud?" Blackwell and Carlos watched in horror as a reporter began discussing anonymous sources, questioning Maria's immigration status. The diner fell silent, all eyes drawn to the unfolding drama. Back in her office, Maria sat amid the shattered glass, tears streaming down her face. Sarah had stepped out to call campus security, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. She picked up a framed photo of her late husband and son, her fingers tracing their smiling faces. "What have I done, Miguel?" she whispered. "How did I think I could belong in this world?" Just then, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know the truth about you, Gonzalez. Resign now or we'll make sure everyone else knows too." As Maria stared at the threatening message, a cold fear gripped her heart. She had wanted to honor her heritage, to share her knowledge. Instead, she had exposed herself, and potentially her family, to dangers she never could have imagined. Outside her window, the media frenzy continued unabated. The story of the illiterate Harvard professor had captured the nation's imagination, becoming a battleground for larger debates about education, immigration, and the very nature of knowledge itself. Maria Gonzalez, once an invisible cleaner in Harvard's hallowed halls, now found herself at the eye of a storm that threatened to upend not just her life, but the entire academic establishment. As night fell over Cambridge, she faced a critical decision: stand her ground and fight for her place at Harvard, or retreat to the safety of anonymity she had known before. Little did she know that events were already in motion that would make that decision for her, pushing her story towards a climax that would shock the nation and change the face of higher education forever. As dawn broke over Cambridge, Maria found herself standing before the imposing facade of Harvard's main administration building. The weight of the past few days hung heavy on her shoulders, but a newfound determination burned in her eyes. She had spent the night soul-searching, remembering her grandmother's words and the faces of her students who found value in her teachings. She couldn't give up now. Inside, the boardroom was a powder keg of tension. On one side sat Professor Blackwell, flanked by supportive faculty members and, surprisingly, Carlos. On the other, Professor Thornton led a group of stern-faced opponents. At the head of the table, University President Dr. Eleanor Hughes surveyed the scene with a grim expression. "This emergency meeting of the Board of Governors will come to order," Dr. Hughes announced. "We are here to address the unique situation regarding Professor Maria Gonzalez." As if on cue, the door opened and Maria entered. A hush fell over the room. She took her seat next to Blackwell, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Professor Thornton wasted no time in attacking. "Members of the board, I submit that Maria Gonzalez's appointment is not only a mistake but a danger to Harvard's reputation. Her lack of formal education, her inability to read or write, and now these questions about her immigration status." "Objection," Blackwell interrupted. "Any claims about Mrs. Gonzalez's immigration status are unsubstantiated rumors, likely spread by those who oppose her appointment." The room erupted into heated arguments. Maria sat silently, her eyes darting from face to face, feeling more out of place than ever. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the chaos. "If I may speak?" All eyes turned to Carlos, who had risen from his seat. Dr. Hughes nodded, curiosity overriding protocol. "My name is Carlos Gonzalez," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I'm Maria's son and a student at Boston University. I'm here to tell you that my mother's appointment isn't just about her. It's about all of us whose stories don't fit neatly into academia's traditional boxes." He pulled out a stack of papers from his bag. "These are letters. From other children of immigrants, from students of indigenous descent, from people who saw themselves represented in higher education for the first time because of my mother's appointment." As Carlos spoke, Maria felt tears welling in her eyes. Her son, whom she had sacrificed so much for, was now standing up for her in front of Harvard's most powerful figures. But the moment was shattered by Jason Thornton bursting into the room, waving a folder. "I have proof," he shouted. "Proof that Gonzalez is here illegally." The room descended into chaos once more. Accusations flew, voices raised, and in the midst of it all, Maria stood up. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice carrying an authority that silenced the room instantly. All eyes turned to her as she took a deep breath. "I came to this country as a child," she began, her accent thick with emotion. "My parents brought me here for a better life. Yes, we entered illegally, but this country has been my home for over 30 years. I've worked hard, paid taxes, raised a son who's now in college." She turned to face Jason. "You want to expose me? Fine. I've lived in fear of this moment for decades, but I'm not ashamed of who I am or where I came from." Maria then addressed the entire board. "I know I'm not what you expected in a Harvard professor. I can't read your books or write your papers, but I carry with me knowledge that can't be found in any library. Knowledge that's disappearing as my people's language and culture fade away." She gestured to the students watching through the room's glass walls, their faces pressed against the glass in support. "These students don't care about my degrees or my papers. They care about what I can teach them, about connecting with a heritage many of them thought was lost." As Maria spoke, a shift began to occur in the room. Even some of her staunchest opponents found themselves moved by her sincerity and passion. Dr. Hughes held up a hand for silence. "Mrs. Gonzalez, your honesty is appreciated, but you must understand the position this puts us in. There are laws." She was interrupted by a commotion at the door. A maintenance worker burst in, out of breath. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he panted, "but you all need to see this." He turned on the room's large screen, flipping to a news channel. The headline made everyone gasp. "Exclusive. Harvard professors caught in immigration sting operation." The report detailed how an undercover journalist had recorded Professor Thornton and her allies discussing plans to exploit Maria's immigration status for their own ends. The footage was damning, showing the depths of their prejudice and willingness to break the law to remove Maria. The room erupted once more, but this time, the tide had turned. Professor Thornton and her supporters found themselves on the defensive, their faces pale with shock and fear. Dr. Hughes, her face a mask of controlled fury, turned to address the board. "It seems we have a much larger issue on our hands than Mrs. Gonzalez's appointment. This meeting is adjourned while we deal with this development." As the room cleared, Maria found herself surrounded by supporters. Carlos hugged her tightly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, Mom." Professor Blackwell approached, a weary smile on his face. "It's not over yet, Maria, but I think the worst has passed. You've shown incredible courage today." Maria nodded, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of events. As she left the building, she was greeted by a crowd of cheering students and supporters. For the first time since this ordeal began, she allowed herself to smile. The battle wasn't over, but in facing her fears and speaking her truth, Maria had won something far more valuable than just her position at Harvard. She had reclaimed her dignity and shown that knowledge and wisdom could come from the most unexpected places. As the sun set over Cambridge, casting long shadows across Harvard Yard, Maria Gonzalez stood tall, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. In the weeks following the dramatic board meeting, Maria's story transcended the bounds of academia, igniting a national conversation about education, immigration, and the true nature of knowledge. Harvard's campus buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Students from all backgrounds flocked to Maria's classes, eager to learn not just about Nahuatl, but about resilience, cultural preservation, and the power of oral tradition. One crisp autumn afternoon, Maria stood at the podium in a packed auditorium. This wasn't a regular class. It was a special lecture open to the public, and the audience was a mix of students, faculty, and community members. Today, Maria began, her voice strong and clear. "We're going to explore the Nahuatl concept of Insochil, Incuicatl, flower and song. But first, I want to share a story." She took a deep breath, then launched into a tale of her grandmother, of nights spent under the stars in Mexico, listening to ancient legends. As she spoke, her words painted vivid pictures in the minds of her audience. Even those who had come as skeptics found themselves drawn in by the power of her storytelling. In the back of the room, a group of educators from across the country watched in awe. They had come to see firsthand the professor who was challenging traditional notions of academia. "It's revolutionary," whispered Dr. Amelia Chun, a curriculum developer from California. "She's not just teaching a language, she's preserving a whole way of thinking, a whole worldview." As Maria's lecture concluded, the audience erupted into applause. Questions poured in, not just about Nahuatl, but about her journey, her teaching methods, her vision for education. Meanwhile, across campus, significant changes were underway. The scandal involving Professor Thornton and her allies had led to a series of resignations and a thorough review of the university's hiring practices and treatment of non-traditional faculty. President Hughes, determined to turn the crisis into an opportunity, had formed a task force to explore ways of incorporating more diverse forms of knowledge into Harvard's curriculum. Maria, much to her surprise, had been asked to co-chair the committee. In her tiny office, now adorned with student artwork and letters of support from around the world, Maria met with Sarah to discuss their latest project. "The online course is really taking off," Sarah reported excitedly. "We have participants from 50 countries now, all eager to learn Nahuatl and explore Mesoamerican culture." Maria nodded, a mix of pride and disbelief on her face. "It's amazing to think that just a few months ago, I was mopping these floors. And now," her voice trailed off as she glanced at a framed newspaper article on her wall. The headline read, "From Janitor to Professor, How Maria Gonzalez is Revolutionizing Higher Education." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. It was Carlos, beaming with excitement. "Mom, you won't believe this," he said, brandishing a letter. "Remember that law we talked about? The one to provide a path to citizenship for long-term residents who've made significant contributions to education or culture." Maria nodded, her heart racing. "It passed," Carlos exclaimed, "and you're being held up as a prime example of why it's needed. They want you to speak at the White House next month." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. After decades of living in the shadows of fearing discovery, she was finally going to be recognized not just as a professor, but as a full-fledged American. As the news sank in, Maria's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Professor Blackwell. "Turn on the TV, Channel 7. Now." Puzzled, Maria flipped on the small television in her office. A news anchor was mid-sentence. And in a surprising turn of events, the Nobel Committee has announced a special recognition for contributions to cultural preservation and educational innovation. Among the honorees is Harvard professor Maria Gonzalez, whose unconventional journey from janitor to educator has sparked a global reassessment of what it means to be a teacher in the 21st century. The room erupted in cheers. Sarah hugged Maria tightly, while Carlos looked on, his eyes shining with pride. As the excitement subsided, Maria found herself drawn to the window. Below, she could see students crisscrossing the quad, their lives intersecting in countless ways. She thought about the ripples her story had created, ripples that were now spreading far beyond Harvard's gates, touching lives around the world. "Flower and song," she murmured to herself, remembering the Nahuatl phrase. Her journey had been both a blossoming of unexpected potential and a song of triumph against overwhelming odds. As the late afternoon sun bathed Harvard Yard in a golden glow, Maria Gonzalez, janitor, mother, professor, innovator, smiled. She had found her place in this world of words and ideas, not despite her background, but because of it. And in doing so, she had opened doors for countless others to follow. The story of the illiterate professor had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of knowledge in all its forms, and a reminder that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. As Maria turned back to her son and her teaching assistant, ready to plan their next steps, she knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The true impact of her journey was only just starting to unfold, its ripples spreading outward, touching shores she could not yet imagine. The whirlwind of Maria's sudden fame brought with it a new set of challenges. As she stepped onto the stage at the White House, her heart pounding beneath her carefully chosen blazer, she faced a sea of cameras and expectant faces. "Buenos dias," she began, her voice wavering slightly before finding its strength. "Good morning, Nilsa." As Maria shared her story with the nation, weaving together personal anecdotes with impassioned pleas for educational reform and immigrant rights, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She was no longer speaking just for herself, but for countless others whose voices had long been silenced. Back at Harvard, Maria's classes had become a hotbed of innovation. Students were creating multimedia projects that combined traditional academic research with oral histories, digital storytelling, and community outreach. However, not everyone was thrilled with these developments. A vocal minority of traditionalists continued to argue that Maria's methods were lowering academic standards. Op-eds appeared in conservative publications questioning whether Harvard was sacrificing rigor for the sake of diversity. One particularly tense faculty meeting found Maria defending her teaching methods to a group of skeptical colleagues. "With all due respect, Professor Gonzalez," a bespectacled economist interjected, "how can we be sure your students are achieving the same level of competence as those in more traditional courses?" Maria took a deep breath, reminding herself of how far she'd come. "I understand your concerns," she replied calmly, "but I invite you to attend one of our final presentations. You'll see students engaging with complex linguistic concepts, historical analysis, and cultural anthropology in ways that go beyond what's possible in a traditional paper-based assessment." As the debate raged on, Maria found unexpected allies. Professors from other departments began incorporating elements of her teaching style into their own courses, finding that it engaged students more deeply and led to more meaningful learning outcomes. Meanwhile, Maria's influence was spreading beyond academia. Community centers across the country were launching programs inspired by her work, offering classes in indigenous languages and cultures. Tech companies were developing apps to support oral language preservation, with Maria serving as an advisor. But with greater influence came greater scrutiny. Maria found herself navigating a complex world of media appearances, policy discussions, and academic conferences. There were moments when the pressure felt overwhelming, when she longed for the simplicity of her old life. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing a draft of her upcoming book, Wisdom Beyond Words, Redefining Knowledge in the 21st Century, Maria received an unexpected visitor. Professor Gonzalez? A hesitant voice came from the doorway. Maria looked up to see Jason Thornton, his face a mask of discomfort and regret. "Jason," Maria acknowledged, her tone cautious but not unkind. "What can I do for you?" The young man shifted nervously. I wanted to apologize," he said finally, "for everything. The way I behaved, the things I said and did. I was wrong." Maria studied him for a moment, seeing not the angry opponent of months past, but a young person struggling to reconcile his preconceptions with a changing world. "Thank you, Jason," she said softly. "That can't have been easy to say." As they talked, Maria realized that this conversation represented something larger than just one person's change of heart. It was a microcosm of the broader shifts happening in society, difficult, sometimes painful, but ultimately necessary. As Jason left, visibly relieved, Maria turned back to her book draft. She had been struggling with the conclusion, but now the words flowed freely. "Education is not about filling empty vessels with facts," she wrote. "It's about lighting fires of curiosity, about preserving the wisdom of the past while embracing the challenges of the future. Most of all, it's about recognizing that knowledge comes in many forms, and that every person, regardless of their background, has something valuable to teach us." Outside her window, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, blanketing Harvard Yard in white. Maria watched the students hurrying across the quad, each carrying their own stories, their own unique forms of knowledge. She smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the wisdom of her ancestors and the support of a growing community of changemakers. As she turned back to her work, Maria knew that the true test of her impact was yet to come. The seeds had been planted. Now it was time to nurture them and watch them grow. 5 years had passed since Maria Gonzalez first stepped into a Harvard classroom as a professor. The autumn leaves in Harvard Yard were a vibrant tapestry of reds and golds, mirroring the rich diversity of students crisscrossing the paths. Maria stood at the podium of a grand lecture hall, but this wasn't just any ordinary class. It was the inaugural session of the Global Indigenous Knowledge Summit, an event that had drawn educators, activists, and indigenous leaders from around the world to Harvard. "Welcome," Maria began, her voice confident and warm. "Bienvenidos, Niltsa. Today, we gather not just as academics or students, but as keepers of ancestral wisdom, as bridges between past and future." As she spoke, Maria's gaze swept across the auditorium. She saw faces young and old, from every corner of the globe. There was Carlos, now a rising star in educational policy, beaming with pride from the front row. Sarah, her former teaching assistant, now headed a nonprofit dedicated to preserving endangered languages through technology. But it was the faces she didn't recognize that moved her most. Indigenous elders sharing space with tech entrepreneurs, Oxford professors seated next to shamans from the Amazon. This gathering was the culmination of a dream she'd scarcely dared to imagine when she first picked up that mop in Widener Library. As the summit progressed, Maria found herself at the center of a whirlwind of ideas and innovations. Panels discussed everything from incorporating indigenous agricultural practices into climate change solutions to using virtual reality to preserve oral storytelling traditions. During a break, Maria stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. A young woman approached her, eyes shining with admiration. "Professor Gonzalez," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I just wanted to thank you. I'm the first in my family to go to college. Your story, your work, it gave me the courage to believe I belonged here too." Maria embraced the young woman, feeling the weight of her words. This, she realized, was her true legacy, not the accolades or the policy changes, but the doors she'd opened for others to follow. As the summit drew to a close, Maria found herself in a heated discussion with university administrators and government officials. The topic: scaling up her educational model nationwide. It's not just about adding a few cultural courses, Maria argued passionately. It's about fundamentally rethinking how we value and transmit knowledge. Every community, every individual has something to teach us. Our job is to listen and learn. The conversation was interrupted by breaking news on a nearby screen. Congress had just passed a landmark education bill, heavily influenced by Maria's work. It provided funding for preserving indigenous languages, incorporated alternative forms of assessment into standardized testing, and created pathways for non-traditional educators to enter academia. As cheers erupted around her, Maria felt a bittersweet pang. She thought of her grandmother, of the nights spent listening to ancient stories under starry skies. "We did it, abuela," she whispered. "We showed them the value of our words." Later that evening, as the summit wound down, Maria found a quiet moment with Carlos and Sarah. They sat on the steps of Widener Library, the very place where Maria's journey had begun. "So, Mom," Carlos grinned, "what's next?" "Running for president." Maria laughed, shaking her head. "No, mi hijo. I think I've had enough of the spotlight. It's time to pass the torch." She looked out over the yard, where students from the summit were mingling, exchanging ideas and contact information. "Our work is just beginning," she said softly. "We've opened the door, but it's the next generation that will walk through it. Our job now is to support them, to ensure that the fire we've lit continues to burn bright." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when I first signed up to be your TA, I thought I was going to be teaching you. Instead, you taught all of us, more than we could have imagined." As the three sat in companionable silence, watching the sun set over Harvard's iconic spires, Maria reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. From a small village in Mexico to the halls of America's most prestigious university, from living in the shadows to shaping national policy, it had been a path filled with struggles, triumphs, and countless surprises. But as she looked towards the future, Maria felt not weariness, but a renewed sense of purpose. The world was changing, slowly but surely, becoming more open to diverse forms of knowledge and experience. And she had played a part in that change. "You know," Maria said finally, a smile playing on her lips, "I think it's time I learned to read." Carlos and Sarah exchanged surprised glances. "But Mom," Carlos began. "You've always said." Maria held up a hand, her eyes twinkling. I know, but if I've learned anything from all of this, it's that it's never too late to start a new chapter. Besides," she added with a chuckle, "I think it's about time I read some of these books I've been teaching about." As laughter echoed across the yard, mingling with the excited chatter of students and the distant toll of the campus bells, Maria Gonzalez looked to the future with hope and determination. Her journey had been extraordinary, but she knew that the most exciting chapters were yet to be written, not just for her, but for all those whose lives she had touched. The illiterate professor had become a catalyst for change, a bridge between worlds, and a beacon of hope for countless others. And as the stars began to twinkle over Harvard Yard, Maria knew that this was not an ending, but a new beginning for her, for education, and for the countless voices yet to be heard. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.